Over Singapore's skies, a storm of heavy rain and fierce winds is raging. Dozens of aircraft are circling above, anxiously waiting for a break in the weather. Amid the chaos, a Boeing 777 carrying 280 people is holding in the air, but its fuel reserves are running dangerously low. As the severe weather continues to spread, the pilots' options are shrinking. Will they be able to land safely at the airport? This is the story of Singapore Airlines Flight 319. On October 24, 2022, a Singapore Airlines Boeing 777 was preparing for departure at London Heathrow, bound for Singapore. It would be a 13-hour journey. In the cockpit sat a 55-year-old captain, a veteran pilot with over 14,000 flight hours, almost 10,000 of those on the Boeing 777. For this flight, he would serve as the monitoring pilot, while the first officer would handle the controls. The first officer, aged 31, had logged more than 2,000 flight hours, almost all of them on the Boeing 777. Also in the cockpit was a relief captain, who would take over during the cruise so that the captain and first officer could rest before arriving in Singapore. Before the flight, all three pilots reviewed the route and the weather forecast for Singapore at arrival. Terminal forecasts showed they might encounter intermittent thunderstorms and rain, quite typical for Singapore, where warm seas all year round often fuel storm clouds. The pilots considered loading extra fuel to deal with potential thunderstorms. But since the forecast remained within safe limits and no major weather systems required rerouting, the captain ultimately decided to stick with the planned load, 100,600 kilograms of fuel. In addition, air traffic control would usually offer them shortcuts along the European leg of the journey, helping to save time and fuel.
This meant they would likely arrive in Singapore with more fuel reserves than planned. If conditions worsened, the pilots still had several alternatives. Near Changi Airport was Paya Lebar Air Base, and nearby in Malaysia were Kuala Lumpur and Senai Airport. After completing all preparations, and once the crew and aircraft were ready, the plane pushed back from the gate. The pilots started the Boeing 777's two massive engines and taxied toward runway 27R. Since its first flight in 1972, Singapore Airlines has been one of the nation's most important symbols, widely regarded as one of the world's top airlines, renowned for its safety, reliability, and service. But as Flight 319 taxied on the far side of the world, the pilots were about to face a life-or-death struggle that none of them had expected. As the first officer lined up on the runway, he pushed the throttles forward to takeoff power. Moments later, Flight 319 lifted into the night sky. Half an hour later, as the aircraft crossed into Belgium, the Boeing 777 reached its initial cruising altitude of 31,000 feet. The pilots planned to hold this altitude until enough fuel had been burned off, making the plane lighter and allowing it to climb higher where it would fly more efficiently. Flight 319 was scheduled to land in Singapore at 9 a.m. local time. It was a long overnight flight. After the meal service ended and the cabin lights were dimmed, many passengers tried to rest. In the cockpit, everything unfolded as the crew expected, smooth and uneventful. With less nighttime traffic along the route, air traffic control even gave them several shortcuts.
It had been nearly 12 hours since Flight 319 departed London. The Boeing 777 was now preparing to descend towards Singapore. At this point, the relief captain returned to his seat to rest, while the two main pilots, feeling relatively refreshed after their rotations, resumed control of the aircraft and began planning the arrival procedure. Ahead of them lay Malaysia, with the Strait of Malacca to the right. Flight 319 would pass north of Kuala Lumpur, before approaching Singapore from the north. According to the flight management computer, the plane was expected to land with around 7,000 kilograms of fuel remaining, well above the regulatory minimum of 3,000 kilograms. This minimum fuel requirement ensured that even after a go-around at the destination, the aircraft would still have enough fuel to hold at 1,500 feet for 30 minutes. Air traffic control informed the crew that runway 20R at Singapore was in use. This was convenient for them as it allowed for an almost straight-in approach. But for the aircraft already attempting landings on 20R, the situation was deteriorating. The wind suddenly shifted direction, causing arriving planes to face a tailwind exceeding 10 knots, beyond the safe tailwind limits for most commercial aircraft. Such sudden wind shifts are common in thunderstorm conditions. Because of the restrictions, the controllers could not clear Flight 319 for an immediate approach. Instead, they instructed the flight to enter a holding pattern at a waypoint called Paspu, about 140 miles from the airport. The first officer entered the holding instructions into the flight management computer and began the descent. At 4:05 p.m., the aircraft entered the holding pattern near Paspu.
The captain activated the weather radar, scanning back and forth to map the storm cells and gain a clearer picture of real-time conditions. As they circled in the hold, the pilots could clearly see intense rainfall over Singapore. More concerning still, their alternate airports, Paya Lebar Air Base and Senai Airport, were also covered by heavy rain. This was not good news. Fortunately, farther south, over Indonesia's Batam Island, weather conditions appeared to be better. The reported winds were lighter, and although there were some showers, they were far less intense and widespread than those over Singapore. The crew therefore considered Batam as a potential alternate airport in case they were unable to reach Singapore. At the same time, however, the winds over Singapore shifted violently once again. Now, conditions favored the use of the opposite runway, runway 02L, instead of the planned 20R. For Flight 319, as well as many other aircraft approaching from the north, this meant they could no longer fly straight to the airport. They would have to leave the holding pattern and maneuver southward to line up with the opposite runway. The pilots reprogrammed the flight management system, changing the approach from 20R to 02L. Soon after, they were cleared to exit the hold. Air traffic controllers began guiding them by radar toward an approach to runway 02L. By this point, passengers had been instructed to fasten their seatbelts, and the cabin crew had completed final preparations for landing. But the situation was far from favorable. Heavy rain was pouring over the airport, and visibility had already dropped to just 2 nautical miles. Within minutes of the controllers reporting this to the crew, visibility plummeted further, down to only 500 meters. This was entirely unexpected for the pilots. Still, as long as visibility did not worsen further, an approach would technically remain possible. The crew pressed on with their preparations for landing, running through the approach checklist and reducing speed. But just as the crew had finished all preparations, yet another piece of bad news arrived. The winds had shifted once again. Aircraft attempting to land on runway 02L were now encountering tailwinds beyond operational limits. It seemed that whichever runway the airport selected, the wind would reverse at the critical moment. By the time Flight 319 was ready for its approach, 2 other aircraft had already been forced to go around, unable to land due to sudden wind shifts and heavy rain. Although conditions were terrible, theoretically, the pilots could still attempt an approach, hoping the weather might improve at the last moment near the runway. But before they even had the chance, the controller's voice came over the radio. All approaches to Singapore were suspended. Controllers needed time to reassess the weather situation. From this moment on, the crew's situation would only become more complicated. Air traffic control instructed Flight 319 to proceed to a waypoint called Samco and enter a holding pattern there, with an expected delay of 5 minutes. As the aircraft flew toward Samco, the crew once again reviewed the weather at their designated alternate, Batam Island. Encouragingly, conditions there remained excellent.
but a decision had to be made quickly. At low altitudes, fuel consumption rises sharply, and if their holding time extended beyond 5 minutes, they would have no choice but to divert to another airport. The captain informed air traffic control that they could hold for no more than one circuit. After that, they would be forced to divert. At around 4:30 p.m., Flight 319 entered the holding pattern over Samco. Fortunately, Samco was located almost equidistant from both Singapore and Batam Island. In a sense, either airport was equally convenient to reach. Now all they could do was wait for instructions from controllers on where they would ultimately be sent. But as they circled in the hold, worse news came over the radio. Visibility in Singapore had dropped below 500 meters with no sign of improvement. By this time, Flight 319's fuel was running low. Controllers immediately informed Indonesian ATC about the situation, notifying them that the aircraft might need to divert to Batam. Even so, the crew still preferred to land in Singapore. It was their intended destination, and they hoped the weather might improve before their arrival. But the captain's earlier decision in London not to load extra fuel was now becoming a growing liability. As the aircraft entered Samco for a second time, preparing for another circuit, the captain reminded the first officer, after this turn, they would have to divert. Just then, the controllers instructed the flight to head south. This was not what the pilots wanted, as flying south would take them farther away from both Singapore and Batam, their only realistic landing options. The captain immediately questioned ATC about why they were being directed away from both possible airports. The reply came back, Singapore was still closed to arrivals, and Batam had not yet approved the diversion.
Flight 319 was trapped in a deadlock. Unwilling to abandon both viable airports, the captain proposed a compromise. Instead of flying another standard oval-shaped hold or heading south, he requested permission to perform a 360-degree turn directly overhead Samco. This would buy them a few more minutes, a last attempt to delay in the hope that Singapore might reopen. ATC approved the request, but before the crew could actually complete the maneuver, their fuel reached a critical level. If they did not divert immediately, they would be forced to dip into the legally required final reserve fuel. At this point, Flight 319 had no other choice. A diversion was inevitable. The captain informed air traffic control that they needed to divert to Batam. He then took control of the aircraft himself, becoming the pilot flying. Controllers instructed the crew to head south, then turn inbound for runway 22 at Batam. The captain once again asked if Singapore had reopened for arrivals. The answer was still no. Even at this stage, the crew kept trying to confirm whether they could return to Singapore, but by then, that possibility had completely vanished. Approach control first vectored Flight 319 to the south of Batam, heading 120 degrees, then turned them eastward to line up with runway 22. It was a rather indirect route, and still, clearance to land at Batam had not yet been granted. With fuel dwindling rapidly, the pilot's stress levels surged. The first officer radioed ATC, declaring that the aircraft was now in a minimum fuel state. This was not yet an emergency, but it meant the flight was committed to landing at Batam. Any further changes to their clearance would risk the aircraft touching down with less than the final reserve fuel. In other words, any additional delay would force the crew to declare an emergency. But controllers still reported that Batam had not yet approved their arrival. The flight could only continue circling. A few minutes later, at 4:53 p.m., when the aircraft was just 13 nautical miles from Batam, the onboard computer predicted that they would arrive with only their final reserve fuel remaining. At this moment, the crew had no choice left. The captain declared over the radio, "Mayday, fuel emergency." From this moment onward, Singapore Airlines Flight 319 was officially classified as an emergency. Whether or not they had received clearance, the aircraft was now authorized to proceed directly to Batam.
Approach control immediately turned the plane northward and handed it over to the tower controller. While the captain focused on flying, the first officer reviewed the airport's approach charts. The bad news? Runway 22 at Batam did not have an Instrument Landing System (ILS). Pilots generally prefer ILS approaches since the system provides both lateral and vertical guidance, helping them descend precisely to the runway. Runway 22, however, only offered a VOR approach, which provided lateral guidance only. Vertical descent had to be managed manually with the help of approach charts, with the first officer calling out target altitudes at each fix for the captain to follow. This was not an insurmountable problem, but in poor weather it carried significant risks. The decision height for a VOR approach was higher than that of an ILS. Had they been landing on runway 04 with ILS, they could have descended safely to 390 feet. On runway 22, with only a VOR approach, the minimum was 440 feet. The difference might not sound dramatic, but in marginal conditions like these, it could mean the difference between catching sight of the runway or not. The crew began the approach. The captain hand flew the descent, while the first officer read out the required altitudes for each checkpoint. The Boeing 777, being a large aircraft, burned fuel rapidly at low altitude. The pilots knew they had very few chances left. With autopilot keeping the aircraft aligned laterally, the captain carefully managed the descent rate. On the navigation display, a pink marker showed the course toward the runway. More precisely, toward the radio beacon located just beyond the runway's far end. If the aircraft drifted right, the marker shifted left, and the autopilot corrected accordingly. At 1,600 feet, as Flight 319 descended through the clouds, a troubling message came from the control tower. The wind had shifted once again, and now they faced a tailwind.
With winds reaching 30 knots, the conditions were far beyond what the aircraft could safely handle for landing. The severe weather over Singapore had now spread to Batam as well. The captain had no choice but to abandon the approach. He pushed the throttles forward, retracted the landing gear, and climbed the aircraft back to 2,000 feet. The stress in the cockpit intensified. Thunderstorm clouds were closing in on the airport. As they carried out the go-around procedure, the pilots also had to steer around storm cells and prepare for an approach to another runway, this time runway 04. Although the situation was far from ideal, there was at least a glimmer of hope. Runway 04 was equipped with an instrument landing system, the type of approach the pilots knew best. With both lateral and vertical guidance available, they could let the autopilot guide the plane all the way in, and even perform a fully automatic landing if necessary. But first, the captain had to maneuver the aircraft onto the correct heading for the ILS. He began a left turn. A good landing begins with a good approach, and a good approach usually requires enough time and distance to set up properly. But the captain wasn't sure how much time and fuel they had left. Instead of flying a long standard pattern to establish a clean approach, he opted for a teardrop-shaped maneuver, swinging the plane around quickly to line up almost immediately with the ILS course. This added greatly to the workload in the cockpit. The captain had to ensure the turn would align the aircraft smoothly with the localizer, while the first officer reprogrammed the flight management computer for the new ILS approach. As the aircraft completed most of the turn, the crew finally caught sight of the runway. The first officer immediately notified ATC. They had the runway in sight. Control then handed them over to the tower, which would manage this landing attempt. Because they were so close to the runway, the captain judged that the autopilot wouldn't be able to capture the ILS quickly enough. So he disconnected it and took manual control. His plan was simple: hand fly the jet until it intercepted both the localizer and the glide slope, and then re-engage the autopilot to let the aircraft land itself. Torrential rain now engulfed the aircraft, visibility collapsing to just 500 meters. Under the crushing workload, the first officer failed to make radio contact with the tower.
both pilots were fully absorbed in keeping control of the flight path. With the rain obscuring their view, the controllers could not see the aircraft either, and so no landing clearance was issued. At most airports, including Batam, aircraft typically intercept the instrument landing system at 2,000 to 3,000 feet, 10 to 15 miles from the runway. But Flight 319 was not set up this way. The captain had kept the aircraft too close to the field. By the time the primary flight display finally showed a captured localizer and glide slope signal, the jet was already at just 800 feet. It was, in truth, a very rushed approach. The captain re-engaged the autopilot, hoping the system could guide them in. But moments later, a warning appeared on the primary flight display: auto land not available. Checking the indicators, the captain saw that the aircraft was badly off the required course, both laterally and vertically. An automatic landing demands more precision than a manual one. With the approach this unstable, auto land was impossible. The warning came as a shock. The captain had been counting on the autopilot to bring the aircraft down, but with only seconds remaining, that plan had to be abandoned. He disconnected the autopilot and took manual control, desperately trying to realign with the glide path. But it was too late. The aircraft was already far too close to the ground to correct in time. At just 130 feet above the ground, the captain made the call, a go-around. The Boeing 777's massive engines roared, straining to lift the heavy jet back into the sky. But the situation had become desperate. 2 landing attempts on different runways had failed, and now the aircraft's fuel was nearly exhausted. Most airlines have a policy. After 2 failed landing attempts, if the chances of a third are slim, the crew should divert to another airport. But with fuel almost gone, this Boeing 777 could not possibly return to Singapore or reach any other destination. They had no choice left. They had to land here no matter what. Nearly 280 passengers were waiting for that outcome. The pressure was immense. For the first time since the earlier approach attempt, the captain contacted the tower, informing them that he was going around. In hindsight, the captain's decision to fly such a short approach and to rely on auto-land likely cost the crew their precious second chance. Had he chosen a longer setup and flown the aircraft manually, the jet might already have been safely on the ground. But the failed approach had another cause: preparation. The runway's final approach course was not perfectly aligned with the runway itself. That meant an automatic landing was never possible from the start. When preparing for the approach, the crew had overlooked this critical detail. The final approach course was 041 degrees, while the runway heading was 012 degrees. As Singapore Airlines Boeing 777 pilots, they were accustomed to operating into major international airports, most of which supported autoland. But Batam was not one of them. Making matters worse, they had relied too heavily on the airline's internal briefing documents. Normally, such materials would note whether autoland was available at a runway, a crucial piece of information. But Singapore Airlines had no systematic process for verifying and cataloging these details across all its destinations. Instead, the briefing notes were pieced together over the years by pilots adding bits of personal experience. And in the case of Batam Airport, the fact that autoland was unavailable was never mentioned. But now, there was no time to analyze what had gone wrong. The captain began a right-hand turn, climbing to 3,000 feet. He flew the aircraft parallel to the runway, trying to set up for another attempt at runway 04. Controllers reported winds from 340 degrees at 7 knots. By this point, the captain had already flown past the airport, heading southwest to intercept the approach. He told ATC plainly, with fuel critically low, he could only land on runway 04, and this attempt had to succeed. As the aircraft maneuvered back toward the runway, controllers relayed a sliver of good news. Visibility had improved, rising from 500 meters to 800 meters. The captain turned toward the runway and began the descent. But the aircraft was too close to the extended centerline to intercept the ILS signal from that side. He had to continue turning across the localizer, then capture it from the other side. The pilots slowed the jet, extended the flaps and landing gear, and prepared for their final landing attempt. By now, the fuel tanks were nearly empty, with only the barest sloshes of kerosene remaining. Even so, the captain still could not see the runway. He had to rely entirely on the glide slope and localizer indicators to keep the aircraft aligned. Finally, Flight 319 broke out beneath the clouds, but a chilling sight awaited the crew. The aircraft was too high and badly offset to the left of the runway centerline. Under normal circumstances, such a situation would call for an immediate go-around, but the crew no longer had that option. They had to attempt the landing or risk running out of fuel in the air. The captain pushed the nose down, increasing the descent rate to 1,400 feet per minute, twice the normal rate of descent. Passengers felt themselves lift from their seats as the aircraft plunged sharply downward, then lurched violently to the left. The captain was fighting desperately to wrestle the jet onto the runway's axis, a final all-or-nothing gamble. What the pilot saw through the windshield bore no resemblance to the stable, orderly approaches they were accustomed to. But there was no alternative now. They would have to force the landing. Suddenly, the rapid descent triggered the aircraft's ground proximity warning system, blaring urgent audio alerts. The captain now faced a terrifying choice. He could follow his training and execute a go-around at the warning, or press on with the landing attempt, risking a catastrophic crash on the runway with such an unstable approach. Both options were unsafe. He had only seconds to decide. At last, he chose training. Just 200 feet above the ground, he pulled the nose up and slammed the throttles forward. By now, the jet was more than 100 tons lighter than at takeoff. Its engines roared, shuddering in the rain, as the Boeing 777 clawed back into the gray skies. It was their third go-around of the afternoon. In the cabin, panic spread among passengers. In the cockpit, despair deepened. 3 failed landing attempts, and now fuel reserves were nearly gone. They no longer had the fuel for even one more standard approach. At any moment, the engines could begin to sputter and flame out. If that happened, the aircraft would lose most of its electrical and hydraulic power, reduced to nothing more than a massive glider falling helplessly toward the ground. In that state, short of a miracle, a safe return to the runway was almost impossible. Fueled by adrenaline and the raw instinct to survive, the captain made a decision, one almost unthinkable in an aircraft of this size. As the aircraft climbed back to 2,000 feet, the captain suddenly wrenched the controls, executing a sharp 180-degree teardrop turn to line up with runway 22. At the same time, he began the descent. The first officer lowered the flaps and landing gear. This truly was their last chance. Approach control reported the wind, from the northwest at 15 knots. It was far from ideal, equivalent to about 5 knots of tailwind and 15 knots of crosswind, dangerously close to the 10-knot tailwind limit for this aircraft type. But the pilots had no choice. Either risk a tailwind landing or crash outright. The captain pressed on, flying the approach entirely by sight. At last, as the turn rolled out, the runway came into view. By this point, the rules no longer mattered. Whether the approach was stable or not was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was getting the plane safely onto the ground. As the 777 closed in on the runway, the tension reached a breaking point. The tailwind pushed their ground speed higher than normal, but a go-around was no longer an option. Attempting one would mean running out of fuel and both engines flaming out. Runway 22 was 4 kilometers long, more than sufficient for a Boeing 777 if the approach could be held steady. In the cabin, passengers held their breath. Just before touchdown, the aircraft rocked slightly left and right. The captain fought the controls, straining to keep the jet aligned. Finally, at 5:19 p.m., Singapore Airlines Flight 319 roared across the runway threshold and slammed down onto the tarmac. The thunderous impact was followed by a long, tense rollout, and then, at last, relief. In the cockpit, the crushing tension was instantly replaced by an overwhelming sense of release. After nearly an hour of life and death struggle, all 280 passengers and crew were safely on the ground. The near disaster of this flight prompted Singapore Airlines to revise its threat and error management model and introduce stricter guidelines. From then on, if the likelihood of reaching the destination airport was low, or if controllers could not provide clear and timely updates, crews were required to divert decisively to an alternate airport. The airline also began a full review of its airport briefing documents, ensuring that every destination contained the same level of detail, including whether autoland was supported. Pilots were further reminded to make their own in-flight assessments, consulting publicly available approach charts to confirm whether a localizer course was properly aligned with the runway heading. Singapore Airlines also took lessons from this event to design simulator training programs that recreated the exact conditions faced by the crew of Flight 319. The training emphasized fuel policy, decision-making under worsening weather, and maintaining safety margins under pressure. The crew of Flight 319 had been fortunate, but as the airline acknowledged, not every crew in similar circumstances would be so lucky.